Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Cutting Room Floor. Thanks for joining me. We get to dig a little bit deeper here into the text from a recent message here at Sunny Slope Church. And this last week, we explored a passage that is perhaps one of the most powerful summaries of what the gospel is really all about. If you're ever trying to figure out what do Christians mean when they talk about the gospel, Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 is, I think, one of the best summaries that you'll find in the Bible, because Paul talks about what we were, and then he talks about what God has done to rescue us, and then he kind of concludes by telling us what we now are. I want to zero in and focus on a part from this that talks about what we were. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that Paul actually, when he talks about what we were, he talks about being dead in our trespasses and our sins. What's striking to me about that is that Paul actually uses two different words to talk about our sinful condition. And by using those two words, I think Paul is trying to expand and really deepen our understanding for what the Bible means when it actually talks about sin. In Western culture, we talk about sin a lot, and for us, it's a pretty generic word. It maybe means, it carries a lot of religious overtones. When we talk about sinful people, we're talking about people who are morally, who fall short morally, perhaps. But usually we associate the idea of sin with religious people. It's sort of like religious people talk about sin a lot. In the Bible, that wasn't necessarily the case. In the Bible, actually, sin was a word that was found in various biblical times. That was a word that was found in various contexts that then Paul sort of imports to help us understand what the idea of sin is really all about. I'm going to share my screen here. And by doing that, what I really want to do is take you through what is like a word study. When we do a word study, we're actually trying to better understand a word in order to better understand a passage. And so here are the two words that Paul singles out. I've got my Bible open to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. Here's the words. Here's first the word trespasses, and then you'll see right next to it the word sins. And so Paul is using both of those, and he's kind of bringing them together so that so that we can understand that what Paul's view of our big problem is not just that we break a few rules, and it's not just that we do some, we make some mistakes, but it's something bigger than that. Now, one of the things that you can do when you're studying the Bible, and especially with the help of language tools like Logos, you can actually you can pull up a word, which I've done here. I'm going to highlight the word trespasses, and then I'm going to do a Bible word study, which is, nope, now I have it open twice, which is right here. If you look down here, you'll see that we have the word sin and trespass, and it's giving us the Greek word here, parapatoma. And you'll see that in the New Testament, that's translated in two major ways. Well, one major way and one minor way. So here's the first where the first way it's translated out of the 19 times that it's included in the Bible. So 19 times this Greek word is included. See that right there. Only one of those times it's translated as transgression. But all the other times it's translated either trespasses, it's translated as a trespass or trespasses. And so you can kind of see here all the occurrences, and you can find all through the Bible all the different passages where that Greek word parapatoma is found, and then you can see that it's either translated as trespasses or trespass. Now, that maybe doesn't help us a whole lot, although it does give us a setting in which when we think about trespassing, we use that word quite a bit in the English language. And when we use it, we're trying to bring to mind the idea of stepping across a boundary into a place that you don't have the right to be. So if a person is trespassing on private property, they've crossed a boundary and they are persisting there. It's not just an accidental overstepping into a boundary, but usually it's the idea that you have crossed a boundary and you're now inhabiting, you're sort of dwelling in that boundary. And so if you start to imagine that, that maybe helps us recognize that when the Bible is talking about sin, if that idea holds up, it means that we are stepping into a way of life that we don't belong. We're sort of persisting in a way of life that we don't belong. Now, we can do a little bit more here in this study. I'm not going to go too far into this, but we can pull up a dictionary here, and actually it will show you, and it'll kind of show us here. Oops, here we go. It'll kind of show us what this actually means. So the handy thing here is that this gives us a whole lot of different senses, but it means, one of the things is it means to fall down. The word peripatoma comes from a root word right here, which is the Greek word pipto, which is to fall. And that actually becomes quite a bit more helpful, because if you start to understand, you start to recognize that the word trespass that we translate into English as trespass is tied to the Greek word to fall. We begin to understand that when Paul is talking about sin and when the Bible is talking about sin, one of the ideas that it has in mind is that we are failing to be the people that we were created to be. We have fallen from a standard or a way of life that we were intended to be. Now you can scroll down and a good theological dictionary will give you a lot of detail on that. And we won't get into all of that here, but just understand that by using that word that carries the idea of falling, Paul is communicating to us about our condition. It's falling from the righteousness and the perfection and the glory that we were created to have. It's interesting, John Calvin in his Institutes, when he talks about sin, one of the things that he says is that we usually think of ourselves as pretty good people, but that's only because we're looking around at other people. We compare ourselves to people and we think, well, I'm not as bad as that person, or I live at least as good a life as so-and-so. But what Calvin says is that we really have to look and compare ourselves to the majesty of God, because when we do that, that's when we see what we were created for, and that's when we see what we have fallen from. Now, let's come back to our Bible here. We'll close these other windows. And we'll look at the second word here, which is the word sins. Now, again, not a word that we always use in common English language today. So what we can do is we can dig a little deeper into this word. We're going to pull up our word study again, just like this. And that's going to give us, again, that's going to give us the Greek word here. And if you don't read Greek, that's the word hamartia, depending on how you pronounce it. And we're going to see that when you look at all the different ways that this word is translated, you're going to see that there are 172 occurrences of the word in the New Testament. You see that right here, 172 times that the word hamartia occurs in the New Testament. And of those times, 170 times it's translated as the word sin. If you're curious what the other two occurrences are, you'll see it's guilt. So 2 of the 172 times it comes out, it's translated as guilt. In any case, our real question then becomes, well, what does this word really communicate? What is this word hamartia? What is it trying to get across to us? And that's where we can go to our Bible dictionary, and you can pull this up, and it begins to give you this idea of walking, and so down here, I'll try to highlight this here. Sin itself is, the word sin is described here, I think it's best summarized right here, negligence or rebelling, guilt and error. And so the biblical sense of sin carries this idea of rebellion, neglecting to do what we are commanded or instructed to do, and falling short of a standard. So there you again, you get the sense of falling, but it's a slightly different way, because the first idea of falling is you were at this level and you have fallen from that state. And the second use of the word here is the idea that here's the standard, but you don't measure up to that standard. The interesting thing about Paul's description here, I think, is that Paul describes it when he describes sin. So he describes sin as trespasses and sins, but he also goes on and he says, in the way which you once walked, following the course of the world, following the prince of the power of the air. Why is that important? It's important because what Paul is getting at here is that sin is not just about our individual choices or our individual mistakes or failures, and it's not even just about living a little bit less than what we were created to live, and it's not even just about falling short of the standard, but ultimately what Paul is saying is those things become a way of life for us. We live short of what we were created to do, and it's a progression that we sort of follow. It's a way of life that we follow. It's interesting, I think, if you read stories or if you follow scandals, for example, if you follow a story of white collar crime, say Bernie Madoff or Elizabeth Holmes, these are fairly recent, at least within the last 20 years or so, stories of people who ended up committing pretty significant accounts of fraud, sometimes to the tune of millions or even billions of dollars. What's interesting in those stories is that neither of those people and neither of the many people like them, they don't start out with this intention to defraud and deceive many people. It usually starts out very small. And it's an action that is justified in their mind, and pretty soon it's, as we say, it's one thing leads to another. And what happens is a person then follows that pathway. And what Paul is getting at is that that's actually true for all of us. There's no one that can claim immunity from this problem of walking in this pathway of sin. The interesting thing, and I think that the powerful thing about the gospel, is that at the very end of the text in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, Paul actually comes back to this, and he says that we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, so that we may do the good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. The interesting thing is, in that particular passage, Paul, the literal phrasing is a little bit, it's a little bit hard to translate smoothly into English, but the ESV, I think, gets it right. It says, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Now, that's really, really significant, because I'm going to put it back up on my screen one more time so that you can see what I'm referring to. It's significant because if at the beginning, Paul talks about we're in this way of life, we're dead in our sins and trespasses in the way that we once walked, then at the very end of the text, Paul comes back to this idea, and essentially he says, now we are walking in a new way of life. In other words, God does not just save us from our mistakes. He saves us from a way of life that is a life of falling short of who we were created to be, falling short of the standards which God calls us to. He saves us out of all of that, and he sets us on a new path. He sets us on a path of obedience. He sets us on a path that is ultimately going to lead to the restoration of the glory that we were created to have from the very beginning. Now, that won't take place until we die and we see Jesus face to face, But then that glory, the fullness of the glory which God created us to bear, that will be restored. And that's the beauty of the gospel. What I think that's the beauty of what Paul is saying, is that salvation is not just you get a get out of jail free card, but you actually get rescued from a way of life that is aimed at death and destruction and eternal alienation from God, and you get put on a whole new path, a whole new way of life. And increasingly, as we follow Jesus, that whole new way of life becomes, we begin to be increasingly Christ-like. Thanks for watching. Join me next time on the cutting room floor. We'll see you again.